G'day, I'm Patrick. Welcome to the workshop. Today I want to talk to you about gluing things on angles, and I'll be making some very simple jigs that allow you to glue two pieces together when they're not exactly a right angle join. In some ways, this technique is similar to the jig I used for gluing up waterfall miter joins. We have a video from a few weeks back about waterfall miter joins. Check that out. It's kind of another application of those types of jigs. In a nutshell, I need to glue this piece on here. Now you can see that there's it's exactly 15 degrees is the angle. And even though the end of that piece of timber is 90 degrees, which makes my life slightly easier, the back face of this timber here is not perpendicular to this joint. And what that means is when you apply clamping pressure, the clamps want to slide. Now, the steeper the join, the more extreme that sliding is, but it is a very real thing, and it will mean that even if your clamps feel tight when you do them up, they may not be tight 30 seconds later or a minute later. The way I'm going to solve that is by using little angled wedges. Now, these angled wedges are the same angle as the piece I'm gluing up. In fact, these were the pieces that got cut out. So I rummaged through the scrap bin and I made these little sandpaper wedges. The reason they have sandpaper on them is so the wedges don't just slide out of the way. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can use double-sided tape, in theory, or you can use super glue. Now, I've done these using super glue, and the reason I know that that is better is because this glue up is not the first time that I've glued these exact joints. Yesterday, I made these same things and I used double-sided tape. And even though double-sided tape is incredibly strong, it has the potential to smear or slide. And so when I was applying pressure, the sandpaper layer and the timber layer, which were glued together with double-sided tape originally, could actually slide against one another, even though the sandpaper was gripping the timber. So I cut those joints apart. I made sure that there was no remaining glue on any of the surfaces, and I'm going to do it again. And this time I have used super glue or CA glue to glue the sandpaper to the wedges. That back surface is where the double-sided tape was previously. I've just taken that sandpaper off and rubbed some dust on it so that the double-sided tape is no longer going to stick to anything. Show you the layout of how this is going to look when it's glued together. These shapes might look a little odd now, but a curved profile will be added to the whole piece. This is a leg assembly for a dining table. There's 4 of these that I have to glue up, and I'm then going to make a template and then I'll cut all the curves out. And that will be a separate video. Right now I'm just talking about this glue up. So everything's labeled. This is my vertical component. All of those lines line up, and there's domino holes in everything. This joinery is just using a 10mm domino by 50mm. Like I said, I actually glued this up yesterday and then cut it apart. In the first glue up, I used PVA, and I was very happy with that, except for the fact that the clamping just didn't work because the little sandpaper wedges slid. Because I used PVA, and I've essentially put the dominoes in the same location, there are some remnants of dried PVA in those domino holes. There shouldn't be much, but to make sure that I have the strongest joint possible, because these really are structural joints, I'm actually going to use a 2-part epoxy instead of a PVA, just because this is the second time I'm gluing this up. If you want more details about the variety of glues that I use, I have a whole video on it, so have a look through the library and check that out. I go through what the different applications are and when you need to use whatever variety of glue you think is best, but I can help you decide that. When you're using Techniglue, you should always use gloves. It's very hard to clean this stuff off your hands when it's wet or dry. I like to use a scale. You don't have to, you can just measure it out, but I'm pedantic like that. And I just mix this on a little flat piece of whatever. This is some scrap timber. It's a 2-to-1 mixture. Don't use the same scoop to scoop the part A and the part B. For this, I've got 8 joins. I have no idea how much I need. I'm just gonna eyeball it. That was 20 grams of the part B, and then I need twice as much of the part A. That's spot on. Mounts to about 60 grams. I think that'll make enough for all of these joints. It needs to be really well mixed. I think it's really important to mix it as well as you can, and then transfer the whole blob onto a new pallet and use a new spreader, and then that ensures that there's no little scrapings of unmixed resin or hardener on the pallet or on the scraper. Again, a little pedantic, but it's a lot better than having a sticky join on something that you prepared the timber really carefully. You wouldn't inherently need to use epoxy on this join. I'm just doing it because I want it to be very strong, and like I said, it's the second time I've glued it, so I'm just being extra cautious. Epoxy or Techniglue epoxy will gap fill really well, so it means that if there's any chance that this joinery is going to be a little bit gappy, also because it's essentially end grain to end grain joinery with one domino, this just adds some extra strength. Okay, that's mixed well enough. I'm going to use a brand new stick, transfer this to a new pallet. Okay, I've got an old pencil that I don't like very much that I'm going to use to poke the epoxy into the holes. Got all my dominoes here, a little mallet for banging the dominoes in, my wedges and my clamps. I'm going to prop this whole thing up on a 5mm strip so that I can orient the clamps a little lower than the work. You'll see as I go. But first of all, just about getting some epoxy in. It's important with dominoes or any other floating tenon that you haven't filled the hole with epoxy or PVA, because it'll mean that the domino won't fit. It'll act like a piston and it'll push the joinery apart. I'm going to add Techniglue to both holes, but only to one surface. I can actually use a little bit more Techniglue. It's not squeezing out, and I want it to really fill every gap. Much better. A little bit of squeeze out, which means that that gap is completely filled. So that's my clamping block. That's the squeeze out. Once you've done a glue up like this, I think it's always worth scraping a tiny bit of glue away on both sides of the join. And that way you can just verify that it is in fact gap free, because the Techniglue as it squeezes out can hide all kinds of problems that you just can't see because it's underneath the goop. So get rid of the goop, check the join, and that way if you need to reposition the clamps, you can. Any squeeze out of Techniglue, you can actually reuse within this gluing session. It takes a while to go off. So as long as it's clean, it doesn't have sawdust or any other impurities in it, you can just scrape it off and put it back on the pallet. This, you can't really do that with any other type of glue really. It does work with Techniglue. have a little chat about clamp placement when you're doing an angled glue up like this. My domino is in the center here, basically the center of the joint, more or less. Following that line. You basically want the line of force to also remain in the center line of your timber. So if you can extend a line up from the center line of your joint, that should basically be where your clamp ends up, and in the center down here. This is pretty obvious on a glue up like this. The angle is not that great, it's not that far off 90. It's pretty easy to visualize where the center of the joint is. But it becomes really important when you're doing much more acute angles. I'll draw an example. If we look at this example here, this joint is actually more acute than 90 degrees. It's, I don't know, a few degrees off. And there'd be a temptation to place your clamping blocks up near the top and apply pressure here. But what that's actually going to do is put your clamping force through that line there, assuming we applied a clamp just there. We actually want the clamping force to be in the center of this joint. The length of this joint is about 110, so our center line is actually 55. So the location of these clamping blocks needs to line up with that center line, which in this instance is a couple centimeters back from the tip. Another way to achieve this kind of clamping that's a little bit more secure is to use this style of clamping block, which is more or less the same. That's cut on 45 degrees, but it's on a sandpaper plywood pad. And that allows us to not just rely on the little piece of sandpaper that would be on the bottom of one of these clamping wedges, but we can actually clamp these long tails to the work, which makes it much more secure. Now these clamping blocks were made for a miter joint, so they're 45 degrees. This joint actually isn't 45 degrees, so the angle isn't quite right, but it should still be close enough in this instance to apply good clamping pressure to that joint. One other note, one way I've seen these clamping cauls made so that you can use them on any angle is to actually have this be semicircular on both of them. What that means in theory is no matter what angle you position these, whatever angle you need that joint to be, you can find a flat spot on this circle, on this half circle to clamp. In practice, I've found this to be a little fiddly. I find that the clamps sometimes slide off the semicircles, but if you only ever want to make one set of these, you could potentially try that. I've said this before, but I generally don't like trying to make a one-size-fits-all solution. It's so easy to make these calls that if I need one for 76 degrees, I'm just going to make one for 76 degrees and then the clamps won't slide off. All it takes to make this is a strip of plywood or MDF, some sandpaper on the bottom, and then gluing an angled block that can be your clamping pad. Okay, one last demonstration. If you need to cut out something and glue it that is very angular or curvy like this and just offers you no good clamping area, because it's on a curve, it's really hard to glue clamping blocks to because they'll just rock. But what we can do is cut the shape out later, and we can cut these pieces in a way that assist our clamping. So our center of join is there. We can draw our guidelines perpendicular to that join. So this means we know that we need to be able to apply clamping pressure there and there to make sure that the clamping force is going through the center of that joint. So depending on the shape of this piece, we could just cut that off and that would give us our flat surface. But if that cut is going to interfere with our curve in some way, we can just notch this out, and you can do it on a bandsaw. So cut there and cut there, and that will give us our clamping surface. So, by following that approach, you've got really secure clamping surfaces. that we've cut out, and then we can cut that shape out later on. I think there's often a temptation to get to your final shape as quickly as possible, but really often the joinery should come first and then you find your shape. And that's exactly what's happening with these pieces. The final shape of these is actually really curved. These pieces become a lot narrower. This transitions into this big sweeping radius. But right now, they're just blocky things, which gives me the greatest ease of clamping. And then I can cut all the curves later on, knowing that my glue joints are nice and tight. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was useful. Next week, I'll be going through the process of templating all of those curves and those shapes and transferring it from a template to all 4 of those leg components using a router and a bandsaw and a few other bits and pieces. It's a great technique and one that everyone should be comfortable with if you want to do this kind of work. So click like and subscribe and you'll get a notification about the video next week and all videos till the end of time. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.